Why in the world would people do this? Well, it turns out most of them don't want to. In the best surveys that one can find of if you could quit smoking, if you could quit vaping, would you? What you find is that at least for cigarette smokers, 70%, 70, want to quit. They would love to quit, and yet they find that to be exceedingly difficult. And the reason they find it to be exceedingly difficult is because of all the brain neurochemistry that we talked about before. The reason I spent close to 20 minutes talking about dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway, acetylcholine in the nucleus basalis, and epinephrine and the relaxation of muscles in the periphery and the increase in readiness in the body and brain, is that all of those combine to make nicotine one of the most powerful and potent cognitive enhancers, and to some extent, physical enhancer, although as I mentioned before, the total number of physical exercise or physical sport promoting effects of nicotine is very, very small, if not zero. There are certain conditions under which one might imagine using nicotine specifically for cognitive enhancement, where performance of complex motor skills would sort of outweigh the negative effects on the neuromuscular system, our ability to generate coordinated movements. There's actually an excellent study looking at the effects of nicotine, not by smoking delivery, but by a different delivery mechanism, in which they looked at performance of hitters in baseball. The experiment was kind of an interesting one. Even though these were fairly skilled baseball players, what they had them do was hit a ball off a tee. As I recall growing up, and admittedly, I didn't play much baseball, but you start off on T-ball, and then you would go, I think it was to pitching machine. Then they would use actual pitchers who throw the ball. But in this case, it was a couple of different baseball-related tasks. They'd have people hit the ball off a tee, but they had to direct that hit toward a ball atop another tee. So it's fairly precise targeting that's required in order to knock that ball off the other tee. So this is an activity that involves not just motor output, but coordinated motor output. And not just coordinated motor output, but directed coordinated output that requires some, as we would say, top-down processing. Right? This isn't the kind of thing that can be done reflexively. This is the kind of thing where the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex in particular, has to be heavily involved in order to suppress certain actions and then create other actions. So the basic takeaway of the study is that nicotine delivered by way of nicotine gum, not by smoking, dipping, or snuffing, was able to increase cognitive performance and motor output. So a rare circumstance where a specific set of demands that involve both cognitive engagement and physical engagement showed a slight but significant improvement. But again, in most cases, nicotine is just simply not going to improve physical output if it's delivered through a smoked cigarette, through vaping, through dipping, or through snuffing. So if all these behaviors are terrible for essentially every aspect of our health, frankly, I mean, when you look at the literature, it's terrible for pregnant women, it's terrible for kids, it's terrible for older people, it's terrible for younger people. I mean, you really cannot find a scenario in which smoking, vaping, dipping, or snuffing are good for us, and yet people like the effects on the brain and they feel quite addicted to them. Even if they say they're not, most of those people would be unwilling to give up their practice of nicotine delivery for more than a few hours. In fact, if you look at the effects of withdrawal, and we are going to talk about what withdrawal of nicotine looks like, what you find is that as soon as 4 hours after the last ingestion of nicotine by way of cigarette or vaping or dipping or snuffing, what people start to experience is some agitation, craving for nicotine, of course. And while craving is kind of a vague concept, it's actually a very specific biological mechanism. It's the drop in dopamine that's starting to occur, so much so that there's a drop in dopamine below baseline. That is, the increase in dopamine that would normally be experienced from smoking, vaping, dipping, or snuffing is now not happening. And in fact, the levels of dopamine are dropping below where they would have been even without performing that behavior. So that's what craving is, and withdrawal is an increased sense of that craving, as well as a lot of negative stuff like stomach aches or nausea or irritability, and often collections of all of them.